I'd like to give you a very warm welcome. And I would just like to start by asking you, how do you see Buddhist teachings as a resource that could guide people who are actively working to alleviate suffering in areas of social service or social justice? What do Buddhist teachings have to offer?
Yeah, perhaps to some extent it represents a change of direction in traditional Buddhism, or maybe we could see it as an unfolding and manifestation of certain potentials which are already inherent in the teaching, but not as well developed or not well developed within traditional Buddhism. So having said that, I should also maybe backtrack and say that at the ground level, on small scales, Buddhists have virtually always been involved in socially uplifting activities in villages, and even in monarchies that have been ruled by a Buddhist monarch. The monarchs have, the good ones have modeled themselves after the ideal of the Raja Chakravarti, the Chakravarti Raja, the wheel-turning king, who is supposed to be like the secular counterpart to a fully enlightened Buddha. And one of the tasks of the wheel-turning monarch is to provide for the welfare and happiness of everyone in his realm. Well, he extends his realm to embrace the entire world, all the 4 continents, and then to promote the well-being and happiness and peace and security of everyone in his realm, including the animals and the birds. And so I would say that provides a kind of ideal for social action for Buddhists. And throughout history, there have been at least some Buddhist monarchs who have emulated that ideal and have tried to establish a realm or a reign based on promoting social and economic well-being of their citizens. And at the ground level, there's been a lot of activity goes on in the traditional Buddhist countries. Even I would say it's like in a country like Sri Lanka, the way I encountered it when I arrived there, somewhat to my surprise, in the 1970s, since we have this model, if you just rely on like the sutta literature, you know, the canonical Buddhist texts, you get the ideal of monks living in remote hermitages in the forests, on mountaintops and so on. But what I found is that the village temples in Sri Lanka serve as the kind of nucleus for all of the social activities of the community, even economic, promoting the economic well-being of the people in the village and town. And so when people have special needs, like the school needs to be repaired, or they need some repair to the road running through the village to connect it with the nearby town, the person that they will speak to serve as the intermediary with the government officials would be the chief monk at the local temple. So I would say some of that can be seen as providing the background for the kind of activities that we've been engaged with through Buddhist Global Relief. But also part of it, I say, was that I've sort of looked over to the side and saw that like Christian organizations, Jewish organizations, Islamic organizations were very actively engaged in large-scale projects of promoting economic and social well-being. And it seemed that there was a lack of Buddhist organizations that were involved in that work. So even though I would say we get our initial inspiration and our inspiration and our model from some of the ethical ideals of Buddhism, but we see the way this is being implemented at the practical level through religiously based philanthropic organizations coming out of other faith traditions. Yeah, you've been muted.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned in that challenge to Buddhists an obligation or call that you were making to help free beings from suffering today,
Yeah.
Requiring that we counter the systemic embodiments
Yeah.
of greed, hatred, and delusion.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about what you mean by systemic embodiments and what we can do to counter them?
Okay. The expression itself sounds a bit abstract, but what I mean is that these three factors that we consider in Buddhism, the three root defilements, sometimes called the three poisons, are now no longer existing in traditional Buddhism. We regard them pretty much as a problem that is infecting individual minds. And we see our task as practitioners of Buddhism to address these problems in our own individual minds, to purify the mind of greed, hatred, and delusion. But what we have found in contemporary society, contemporary economic systems, political systems, is that those three forces, or those three mental factors, take on a force of their own and become manifest and expressed and dominate social systems, institutions, the whole functioning of the economy, even in ways that are terribly self-destructive. Like we have, just to take greed, that becomes manifest in corporate capitalism, which is driven just by the blind drive to maximize profit and to enhance the wealth of a small, privileged, powerful elite, even while inflicting massive damage and harm and suffering on vast masses of people around the world, both in the countries in which the corporations are based, as well as in the other countries around the world, which are subject to the manipulations of the corporations. So we can see that as an expression of greed, and maybe the most worrisome manifestation of greed, the most pernicious, would be the way the fossil fuel corporations are continuing along the trajectory of trying to exploit all of the available fossil fuel resources from the earth, even though we've been issued warning after warning from the late 1970s on, and especially over the last few years, seeing the signs of climate change exploding all around us, and wildfires consuming millions of acres on the West Coast, terrible floods afflicting Europe recently, some parts of the South, fierce hurricanes, storms, tornadoes, and so on. But the greed is operating not only through the individual minds of people involved with the corporation, but it becomes a kind of corporate imperative that the corporation has to continue to grow and to maximize profits. And if the executives that are in charge are not doing their utmost to maximize the profits, they will lose their job and be replaced by somebody who is more aggressive or more skillful in being able to increase the profits of the corporation. So that we could say is a manifestation of greed. Hatred continues on, let's say, expressed and clear manifestations of hatred now have maybe diminished over the decades since maybe the end of the Cold War. But I'd say maybe we could say that hatred has now become manifest, not so much in the form of international conflict, though the potential for that is still there, but it becomes manifest more clearly within national politics. Particularly, I would say one sees it in this country, in the US, in the rise of the rapid, this RABID, not RAPID, inflicted by rabies, the rapid extreme right wing, which is just driven no longer by any kind of positive policies, but just by hatred against any community towards which they can direct their hatred. And even directing the hatred becomes so such an obsession of the mind that we could see today that people, but it becomes certain issues become the basis for this kind of culture wars, even to the point where we have the COVID pandemic now that's swept over this country, and people have become so, say, addicted to the idea that the mark of a true American is to be a true adherent of freedom, is to oppose any kind of government regulation. So we're even willing to put the lives of our children at risk by opposing mask mandates, opposing vaccines, refusing to observe any kind of social distancing or observing any kind of measures of caution to protect our own families, to protect our communities. So a sense of commitment to the common good has been replaced by this dogma of the supremacy of individual freedom, which explodes in various manifestations of hatred. But also, I would say, underlying that, that is where the root of delusion comes in. The idea that the way that we could flourish maximally is by pursuing our own individual self-interest without regard for the impact of our actions upon the community and social order in which we're enmeshed.
So the three poisons give us tools for understanding systemic embodiments or systemic mechanisms whereby greed, hatred, and delusion create harm. So if we see the Buddhist teachings as aimed towards offering a solution to the problem of suffering, what do we have within the Buddhist teachings that can help us address or dismantle or transform these systemic embodiments?
The traditional Buddhist teachings, of course, are directed at individual transformation, as I said earlier, at the individual effort to remove greed, hatred, and delusion, but not only in a rather narrow, self-centered way, but also when we propagate the Dhamma, when we teach the Dhamma, we're instructing people on the need to remove their own greed, hatred, and delusion. And that would fit within what I would call a traditional framework. But perhaps today we need a broader conception of an ethical imperative that we should be following as Buddhists. And that is by looking at, as I said, these manifestations of greed, hatred, and delusion in institutional, social, and political structures, and then working in solidarity to transform these harmful, these pernicious structures and move towards more benign forms of collective social organization. And that would require some kind of very deep and clear analysis of our social and political systems and the promotion of alternatives, healthier, more wholesome, more constructive alternatives to the destructive systems which are dominant today. And maybe it's would be difficult to find Buddhist practitioners who are able to develop and construct visions of those models on their own. But there are social thinkers whose thoughts, I would say, are very much in harmony with the kind of ethical orientation of Buddhism, who have already come up with very, very clear models of alternative systems. But the main problem to implementing models like that, the sort of roadblock, is the way our political system is constructed. The political system is constructed in such a way that for a politician with the kind of wholesome social vision to become elected, he or she has to be able to garner a sufficient number of votes to get into office. And then not only as in the position of president, but we have to have an executive branch, branches of Congress and probably judicial system, which are all committed to a transformative social and economic system. And yet it's extremely difficult for a politician with that kind of vision to rise in political power, because the political system, political careers largely depend on financing from the powerful corporate interests and from multimillionaires and billionaires. And so the money from the corporations, millionaires and billionaires are going to be, the contributions are going to go to those politicians who will advance their interests. And those will not be the politicians who are committed to that kind of alternative vision of an economy that works for all, a social and political system that brings benefits to all. But rather they will promote, the politicians will promote an economic and social system that's going to contribute to the maximization of corporate profits and to the increase in the wealth of the powerful financial elite.
So given the existence of this established structure that's working against change in the way that you describe, what can well-meaning Buddhists do to contribute to positive change?
I'd say first we have to be better informed about the problems, even the dangers that are inherent within the existing system, and to also become better informed about alternatives. And then we have to use, certainly it's something that Buddhists on their own cannot, the kind of changes we need are something that Buddhists alone are not capable of implementing. But rather we have to work in solidarity, I would say, with broader social and political movements that are seeking positive change. So that there are a multitude of organizations out there that are working in different areas with a great harmony of vision, working to promote the kind of changes that we need. For example, in the area of climate, combating climate change, it would be like organizations like 350.org, the Climate Mobilization, I think it's called the Sunlight Project, working for economic organizations, working for economic justice. Again, I would highly recommend the Next Systems Project, organizations working for political change. And so what we have to do is maybe find, as individual Buddhists, find organizations with which we feel some kind of natural rapport, and then help those organizations and contribute to promote the kind of changes that they're advocating for.
And how do we make that part of our Buddhist practice or our worldview?
Yeah, I would say that this should be an essential part of Buddhist practice. So I don't want to say that every Buddhist has to become socially and politically active, because I think Buddhists have different vocations. And if, say, somebody feels that their personal calling is to live a life of secluded meditation in a hut in the forest, I don't want to say that you should give up your seclusion and come back out and start working on environmental issues or economic issues. But certainly there should be Buddhists who are living within the world, within society, who usually think maybe they do have some kind of social and political commitments, but they separate that from their Buddhist practice and think my Buddhist practice is the periods each day that I allocate to meditation or ritual or devotional practices. And then in other parts of my day, I devote to working for a better society. But they could see working for a better society as part of their Buddhist practice. And it would be, I would say that it could fit within the framework of Sila, a kind of broader interpretation of Sila. It's not just moral restraint, but within the Mahayana framework, there's the idea of the three kinds of sila, of restraining the unwholesome, cultivating the wholesome, and then working for the benefit of sentient beings. So this is a way of sila as working for the benefit of sentient beings. And also it's a way of putting into concrete practice the qualities of metta and karuna, maitri and karuna, loving kindness and compassion. So it's not, as I said in that essay, it's not enough for us to treat loving kindness and compassion just as beautiful ideals that we develop in the quietude of our shrine room or our meditation hall, but loving kindness and compassion also requires us to actively work in ways that will alleviate the suffering of sentient beings, which is compassion, and promote their welfare, happiness, and security, which is loving kindness. So in that way, these practices become part of a kind of broad Buddhist ethical agenda.
So thinking about the ethical agenda, could you offer an argument to ground this move from personal practice to engaged work in the world? What is our ethical obligation as Buddhists to work for the collective well-being?
I could mention some sort of motivations, ways of thinking that would motivate us to develop this commitment to the well-being of others. What I found helpful is actually something that I learned from the Tibetan Mahayana tradition, and that is the idea of seeing all, they express it as seeing all sentient beings as one's own mothers from previous lives. But I think we don't have to extend it at the initial stages to all sentient beings, but let us just develop the idea that all human beings could potentially be our mothers or fathers. We don't even have to bring in the idea of rebirth and being our actual parents from previous lives, but we could just develop a mind which looks upon all other human beings as our parents. You know, it's just almost like the throw of the dice of chance that we happen to be born with two people as our parents in a particular country, particular neighborhood, rather than in some other country, some other neighborhood with some other couple as our parents. And so if we broaden our perspective, we could see all human beings in every continent, every country as our parents in different physical manifestations. And then just as we would want to promote the well-being and happiness of our parents and rescue them from danger if they were facing danger, then we should look out upon the world and see especially those people who are living plunged into debilitating poverty, people facing social oppression, people whose basic human rights are being trampled upon. And then when we reflect upon people in that way, that will stir up, I think, the seeds of compassion and concern in our hearts and motivate us to take action to help them. In fact, I don't even like now to use the word compassion so much, which maybe it's a bit overworked. I like to replace it with the word solidarity, which means feeling a sense of deep identification with others. Being able to identify others, as I said, being our own parents or our own sons and daughters, if they're youngsters. And then just as we would wish to rescue our own sons and daughters, our parents, from suffering, so we should be motivated to help those who are facing suffering around the world.
So one of the things that's inspired me about the vision that I've heard you articulate over the course of past years is that you're deepening our understanding of what harm is. So when, we can talk about, poverty, poverty as involving suffering, but you're bringing in also the idea that the inequality of wealth, that is the engine that reproduces that poverty, is also a form of suffering, and therefore is also something that we as Buddhists should be interested in addressing. Can you talk about what you're doing with the idea of what harm is, what is harmful?
In inequality.
It seems that you've gone past the symptoms, the painful symptoms of different forms of what we could call structural violence, to look at the mechanisms that are reproducing them. So racism as something that has, you know, the effect of causing suffering.
I'm not quite sure that I get the import of the question.
I see you as broadening. So when you make this call for engaged Buddhism, you know, we could take that as meaning, now I need to go and bring medicine to people who are ailing. And build homes for the homeless. But we could also, as I hear you doing, understand that to mean that we should also address the institutions, you know, the structures that are generating that form of harm.
I think maybe we could see this as a little bit sort of coming from my own Buddhist background, our shared Buddhist background, where we look at the First Noble Truth describes the various forms of manifestations or expressions of dukkha, of suffering. But then in order to alleviate that suffering, you have to look deep underneath it to see what are the underlying causes or roots of that suffering. And when I speak about the structural or systemic expressions of greed, hatred, and delusion, that is one way to look at it. But another way to look at it, not as deep, but is to look at these structures and institutions themselves. And so some of them you mentioned, like racism and economic inequality, which also very clearly intersect with each other in this country, where there's very clear disparities in wealth and income related to race. The one thing that we found in the work of Buddhist Global Relief, where originally we set ourselves as the objective, sort of the mission for Buddhist Global Relief was to address the problem of chronic hunger and malnutrition around the world. That was the initial mission. But then when we started to look into what are the underlying causes of hunger and malnutrition, we found sort of the underlying, in the broader sense, it's poverty. And then we inquire, like, what is the sustaining factors of poverty? And one of the things we found is that it was very clearly stated by some of the social analysts that I read. One of the main underlying causes of poverty is the subordinate status of girls and women in many traditional cultures. And so we found if we're going to address the problem of hunger and malnutrition, have to address the problem of poverty. And if we're to address the problem of poverty, have to look at the ways to promote the status of girls and women. And the most effective way, especially for girls, is through education. And then for older women, to see that they get some kind of vocational training so that they could earn more to support their families.
And, you know, when we describe Buddhism as a path of nonviolence, most people have no trouble imagining what that might mean. Could you describe for us an understanding of Buddhism as a path that leads to the cessation of structural violence as well?
Okay, so first, like, what are the expressions of structural violence? So we see several different expressions of structural violence. One is economic structural violence, where there's again, the channeling of more and more wealth from within each country and within the world, the global population as a whole, more and more this channeling of more and more wealth to this powerful financial, economic, and political elite, so that great masses of people are living in extreme poverty, not lacking even the most basic resources of food, healthcare, housing, clothing. Yeah, so that's a form of violence when people cannot get the basic necessities of life. And that will also manifest in forms of actual physical violence when, for one thing, it leads to increase in crime within a country. But also I would say that can, I'm just trying to think of, certainly within some countries, it brings violence between countries. I'm trying to think of places where that kind of violence might be manifested today. Perhaps in several African countries where you see particularly the rise of these radical Islamic movements, which in Nigeria are abducting girls and in other countries expressing their extreme dogmatism in the forms of violent retaliation against segments of the population that they resent. Okay, in this country, we have the old heritage of racism, which now takes on, the form of what they call the prison industrial complex, and the police violence against communities of color, and the antagonism towards people, especially on the part of the white population against immigrants and other communities of color. So those are forms of physical violence, which are motivated largely by the structural violence of unjust economic systems. I'm not sure if that addresses your question.
Mm-hmm. I guess I have kind of two areas that I'm just curious to hear from you about. One is what Buddhist, transformative or meditative resources there might be, what conceptual resources there might be for being able to understand how the inner forces of greed, hatred, and delusion get mobilized and get collectively channeled through classism, sexism, racism, which all, seem to be or clearly are manifestations of these three poisons in a collective form. So how we as human beings, as a society, end up making something collective out of these inner forces that we have inside ourselves. So that's one area that I'm curious about. And the other one is, what we can see within Buddhism that could help us to imagine an end.
Okay, to deal with the first question, I would say that sort of the channeling of collective energies under the control of greed, hatred, and delusion has been going on probably throughout human history. But I would say that what has intensified it today and sort of pushed it up to even to a new level, I would say, would be the development of systems of mass communication, which already was taking place through the early and middle decades of the 20th century with radio and then television. But now I'd say it's been almost multiplied to the third or fourth power by the advent of the internet, so that this particularly in regard to hatred. So the internet is being used in this country by the extreme right-wing groups and hate groups and racist groups in order to mobilize their populations and to unite them around common agendas. Again, the use of mass communications has been maybe used to unify people around class interests, particularly those in the upper classes who want to preserve their hold on power. And there have been, and I would say the challenge they facing these small, powerful economic and political elites is when their interests run contrary to the interests of the great masses of the people, and when the interests of the ordinary people are in tension with those of the interests of the small, powerful elite, the elite interests, the challenge facing the elite is how do you get people to act against their own interests by shifting their allegiance over to the kinds of, to promote the politicians who are supported by the elite, by the economic, financial elite. And so the way that the elite has done that very skillfully has been to excite and provoke the masses of people, particularly the ordinary middle class and maybe lower middle class white population, around these issues of what they call the culture war issues, and also the fear, using fear as a tool to engender in their minds the fear that we are losing our country is slipping away from our control into the hands of others, people who have come into the country from abroad, who have become immigrants, who have become citizens or even not citizens, are getting all, and the Black population, they are the ones that are getting all of the benefits from the government. The government is not doing anything for us. And so we have to support those politicians who are seem to be speaking on our behalf. Okay, so maybe that deals with some ways of addressing the first question.
Mm-hmm.
And the second question is, maybe can you reformulate it?
Yeah, the question is, what, just to help us imagine ways to end, or maybe even a vision of on what our world would be like if we could dismantle some of these fundamental forms that are perpetuating structural violence.
Yeah, so I would say that we could imagine, like, from a Buddhist point of view, what would an ideal world be? Mm-hmm. And it doesn't have to be a world which is entirely given over and committed to adopting Buddhism as a religion or as a spiritual practice. But what would be the kind of ideal world from a Buddhist, from the perspective of a Buddhist social philosophy? So I would say it's a world in which two primary requirements, I would say. One is, the first requirement is that we preserve and protect those environmental forces that are essential for the maintaining human civilization, for maintaining a healthy, functioning society. So this means protecting, reducing carbon emissions in order to ameliorate climate change and to bring about steep reductions in carbon emissions to return to a base level so that the destructive impacts of a changing climate can be avoided. But also it means avoiding other forms of environmental pollution, the pollution of the oceans, of the air through other chemical emissions, having clean water, healthy soil through turning away from chemical-based agriculture to systems, ecologically sustainable forms of agriculture, and so on. So preserving the integrity of the natural environment in which human life is embedded. So that is one requirement. And the other requirement is to provide to establish, let's say, social and economic systems that provide first for the material well-being of every inhabitant of the planet, so that every human being has at least a minimally satisfactory standard of living, has access to healthy food, clean water, housing, clothing, a clean environment, means of communication with others, and then providing educational opportunities for everybody, so that everybody can avail themselves of access. Everybody will have access to education so that they can fulfill their own potential, and then having employment opportunities for everybody so that everybody can work at jobs that will be personally, maybe this is a little idealistic, but I'll say it, at jobs that are provide a satisfactory standard of living, provide adequate incomes, and also that promote personal fulfillment. And I say that we don't need a system in which people are compelled to work 10 or 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. But I would say in an ideal economic system, people would be able to work maybe 6 hours, 6 hours a day, 4 days a week, and have 3 days a week of time for themselves to pursue their own interests, hobbies, personal vocations, and have longer vacations, which they could devote either to personal enjoyment or to, again, to pursuing their own interests. And more time is, from a Buddhist point of view, for personal spiritual cultivation.
So I'm listening to this vision. It strikes me that even if we establish it, as long as there's jealousy and hatred and competition, they would be destabilizing such a configuration very quickly.
Yes, but that
so the construction
but that's always the problem with the minds of individual beings. So that's why we also need systems of spiritual cultivation to face those problems and to at least to ameliorate their impact to some extent.
So I guess I'm just kind of curious, how are we getting these two together?
Yeah, let's say I don't think, as long as there are human beings, we won't be able to completely overcome the influence of emotions like jealousy, anger, hatred, greed upon our individual minds. And that either we have to deal with through spiritual cultivation, or else we have to live with people in our midst who are dominated by those emotions. But what is necessary would be to have mechanisms within the social system that could prevent those kind of emotions from serving as attractors or magnets around which large numbers of people gather, and to the point where they become destructive social forces.
Okay, so that's interesting. And so what are some of the safeguards that we could be imagining?
I don't know, since I never faced that question before until you just asked it.
Sorry, I'm very interested in developing my utopic visions, and I think that they actually can be grounded much more frequently than we think. Because there are two options, right? Either we have what sometimes seems to be the standard answer in Buddhism, which is that first we all individually get rid of all of the kleshas, and then we'll have, a perfect world.
Yeah.
Or, and you're offering another alternative to that, which is, well, we don't necessarily need to have everyone gotten to that point. We can be smarter about the social formations that we allow to be established, so that we don't have all of these large scale manifestations of suffering that are caused by the coming together.
Yeah.
And so that's just interesting. I'd like to.
Yeah, I mean, looking realistically at human nature, we'll never find a time when every human being on earth is free from even from the obsessive domination of greed, hatred, and delusion, and their many offshoots. Those who can completely overcome those unwholesome emotions will be very, very few. Probably those few yogis who go off and deeply cultivate their minds over long periods of time. But what is necessary is to create a society in which, let's say, the basic social and economic and political structures are designed to ameliorate the impacts of those destructive emotions, and which there are corrective mechanisms in place to prevent them from becoming powerful destructive forces.
Maybe would ask you if you could share a few reflections for people who feel or have been told that their contemplative practice and their active service is pulling them into opposing directions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, maybe I could state that a little bit biographically. Okay, yeah. Before I became involved with Buddhism, I reached young adulthood back in maybe the middle to late 1960s, when there was, especially this was the time of the Vietnam War, and then I was actively involved in opposing the Vietnam War. And I don't say that it was purely altruistic, but because at my age at that time was such that I was in danger of being drafted into the army, and I didn't want to be drafted and to fight in a war that I didn't believe in. But in any rate, at that time I had this, and also at that time I was also attracted to theoretical Marxism, not to communism as it was embodied in the Soviet Union or in Maoist China, but I saw in Marxism, at least philosophically, a program towards a just economic system which would enable workers to live with dignity at a satisfactory standard of living, whereby they would receive the full rewards of their labor. Okay, when I became involved with Buddhism, then I thought to follow this path of meditation, contemplation, I have to put aside these wider concerns and focus on my own inner development. And so I went off to Sri Lanka in 1972. I hardly looked at a newspaper, and my concern then was just to learn the Dharma and to practice. Then maybe starting about the mid-1980s, I was requested to become the editor for the Buddhist Publication Society. And I had to edit, we started a newsletter in which I had to write an editorial essay for each newsletter 3 times a year. And then I started to reflect upon the significance of the Buddhist teaching for the wider world, not just purely as a system of philosophical understanding or meditative self-cultivation, but what are the implications of these teachings for our wider human condition? And through that, then I felt sort of the need to become more deeply knowledgeable about what is going on in the world. But still my access to that information was rather limited, pretty much limited to what I could see each week we would get the Time magazine at the Hermitage where I was living, and that became my source of information. And after I came back to the United States in 2002, and that was the first time where I really got access to the internet. And then I could see on the various news websites and commentary news sites, get a much fuller picture of what's happening both in this country, the United States, and in the wider world, coming to understand the impact of economic inequality, of racial disparities, of climate change first made its impact on my understanding. And then I felt a sort of strong sense of commitment that if I'm truly going to be putting these qualities, truly going to be following a teaching which puts such emphasis on compassion and loving kindness, I really have to find ways to express these in action. And in the initial stages, it was just by thinking about them and maybe writing some essays about them. But then one of those essays led to the formation of Buddhist Global Relief. And then that became my main channel for putting these qualities into practice. And so I don't want to say that everybody has to establish a social service organization, but people will have different callings, different senses of vocation. So what I would say is to maybe to reflect on the momentous issues that are facing humanity in its collective dimensions today, whether it's climate change, racism, economic inequality, unhealthy political manipulations, and so on. Reflect on these, or even animal rights, the brutal human destruction of animals on this planet. So reflect on these different issues, and then find a particular issue with which one resonates, an issue that really strikes deeply into one's heart. Then try to find an organization that's working in that area, or even perhaps a group of Buddhists who are working in that area, and then join with them, and then create a group or participate in a group committed to some kind of social change.
So I want to thank you for not just the projects that you've done, but what you've done with your steady presence over these years.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
And thank you so much for talking to us.
Okay, thank you.